Imagine a Victorian jail. Your immediate thought is of prisoners held in miserable conditions, incarcerated behind tall, fortress-like walls. For the most part, you'd be right. This was a time when punishment rather than rehabilitation was at the centre of thinking on criminal justice. For men and women alike, a prisoner's time behind bars was a tough and strictly regimented existence of early wake-up calls, followed by hard, laborious work, interspersed by exercise, often held in strict silence, and breaks for meals. Or what passed for meals, for bread and gruel made up much of the diet. On the other side of the bars, the life of a prison guard was, to say the least, challenging. Working up to 15-hour days and frequently short-staffed, they not only had to deal with abuse and physical attacks by prisoners, but, despite exhaustion, could find themselves dismissed for falling asleep whilst on guard. Today, you will discover what it was like to be held in a Victorian woman's prison in London's Brixton and Millbank jails, in an account of daily life from the 1880s told by a contemporary government employee. He gathered first-hand observations from prison officers, matrons, the female equivalent of warders, and, of course, prisoners, most likely from the 1850s onwards, as they follow retirement or discharge. It is worth noting that he makes it clear that he had no personal wrongs to vindicate or clique to satisfy. And so, taken at face value, his words offer an impartial eyewitness glimpse into the lives of women behind bars and the harsh conditions in which they were incarcerated. Millbank Prison, once said to resemble a fortress, was constructed in the early 1800s with a distinctive hexagonal plan, and held hundreds of men and women in separate pentagon-shaped wings. A century later, following demolition, it was redeveloped and is now home to the Tate Britain Art Gallery and the Millbank Housing Estate. It was such a huge and labyrinthine penitentiary, so much so that it was not unknown for its warders to get lost inside its walls. That the scale of its former outline is clearly visible in the modern street layout. Part of its perimeter wall still survives to this day. Millbank was once a prison used to detain prisoners awaiting transportation, but by the time of the account that you will hear today, it had reverted to an ordinary prison. Brixton Prison, south of the River Thames, remains to this day, though now acts as a training facility. Though living conditions later improved, in the early 19th century the prison was severely overcrowded. Living conditions for prisoners were notoriously bad, even for the time, being confined to cramped cells. On arrival, female prisoners were initially held in solitary confinement. By 1850, it had become a women's correctional facility, after Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania, refused to accept the transportation of any more women prisoners from England. These are real people, real events, from the words of prison matrons and the prisoners themselves, and all the more interesting for telling us human stories from prison cells, rather than the history of its walls. It is a story of fallen women, despair and darkness broken by occasional light, but above all, it is a journey into a world hidden to most Victorians, for it is not one of statistics on the expense of keeping prisoners or the amount of work they performed, but describes the grim reality of life for women in a 19th century prison. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you want to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. The most fitting introduction to my work will be to afford you some little idea of the manner in which a prisoner is received at Millbank Prison. Millbank Prison, or Millbank Penitentiary, needs no very long description, and there are few who are not aware that it is situated on the Middlesex side of the River Thames, and that it was, at the time of this account, a prison for male and female convicts. In charge of the female compartment were assistant matrons on probation, assistant matrons, a reception matron, principal matrons, latterly a chief matron, on whom the practical working of the prison really devolves, but to whom the credit is not invariably given. A lady superintendent, a deputy governor, and a governor. The arrival of female prisoners at Millbank was unfortunately almost an everyday occurrence, when prisoners were not arriving from the county jails, from Gloucester, York, Stafford, etc. They were coming direct from the Central Criminal Court, with the sentence of the judge still ringing in their ears, or back from Fulham Refuge and Brixton Prison, where they had insulted officers or set the rules of discipline at defiance, and so were returned to Millbank, where there was little association, a stricter silence, and work more hard. Of the prisoners who make their first appearance on this sombre stage, I desire to speak. The outer bell being rung, the gatekeeper unlocked and swung open the great gates. Inner grated gates of ironwork were unfastened by second gatekeepers, and the cab, or omnibus, or prison van passed through to the door of the reception room, where a matron was ready to hear from the custodian of the woman or women he or she may have brought, the name, age, nature of the crime, and length of the sentence, all of which being duly entered in the register, the new arrivals were formally delivered over to the Millbank authorities. The first inexorable rule to which the new prisoner had to submit, and which is a trial that was always hardest to bear, was that of having the hair cut. With a woman new to the rules, a comer who had not sat in that room before, with the scissors of Atropos snipping round her head, this operation was seldom performed without a remonstrance. Women whose hearts had not quailed, perhaps, at the murder of their infants, or the poisoning of their husbands, clasped their hands in horror at this sacrifice of their natural adornment, wept, begged, prayed, occasionally assumed a defiant attitude, resisted to the last, and were finally overcome only by force. It is still one of the most painful tasks of the prison, this hair-cutting operation. Moreover, it is, in my own opinion at least, a test of character. One woman will be resigned to her fate on the instant, and, with a Socratic stoicism, will compress her lips, submit herself to the shears, and march away to her bath afterwards in a business-like manner. A second will have a shivering fit over it, a third will weep passionately, and a fourth will pray to be spared the indignity, and implore the matron on her knees to go to the lady superintendent and state her case for her. Some women used to be impressed with the idea that coaxing would go a long way towards softening the matron's heart, or at least obtain some relaxation of the rule, and permission to retain a greater length of hair on their heads, and consequently bestowed many "my dears" and "God bless yous" on the operator. The greatest trouble in my matron's experience of prison life was with an old woman of 60 years of age, and with about the same number of grey hairs on her head. She was an old prison bird, had spent 2/3 of her life in confinement, and was as vain of her appearance as any girl of 17. "Now, Miss Butler," she said to the operator, after catching sight of the scissors, and drawing herself up with the haughtiness of a duchess. "Not this time, if you please, Miss Butler. It can't be done." But Miss Butler replied it could be done, and was absolutely necessary to be done before the prisoner left the room. "Things have altered a little, Miss Butler, since I saw you last. I can assure you, you've no power to touch a hair on my head, mum." "How's that?" "If you please, mum, I'm married." And the old woman regarded the matron with undisguised triumph. "And what's that to do with it? Sit down, you really must sit down." "And what's that to do with it?" shrieked the old woman indignantly. "Why, it's my husband's hair now, and you daren't touch it according to the law. It belongs to my husband, not to me, and you've no right to touch it. Lord bless you, the Queen of England daren't lay a finger on it now." And the old woman's staunch faith in the laws of her country to protect her grey hairs would, in any other place, under other circumstances, have been supremely ludicrous. Argument with her was useless. She did not see that anything more was required after an expression of her opinion. She would not object to the bath, because the law had nothing to say in the matter of baths to married women, but her hair couldn't be touched by any mortal power. When she saw that the matron was totally uninfluenced by her eloquent expositions, she demanded to see the governor. He knew the law of England, of course, and when her hair was cut to the statutable length, she vowed to make a full statement of the case to the directors on the next board meeting, and please put her name down to see those directors at once. Such an infamous violation of the laws of her country she had never been a witness to in her time. And strange as it may appear, the plea of marriage has been very often urged by prisoners under the same circumstances. "It's my husband's hair," has now become a constant reason why the rules of the prison should be waived in their particular cases. And when it is not urged as a plea, women, whom a repetition of crime has brought back to the old quarters, generally offer, as their first piece of information, that they have been married since their last incarceration. There is a peculiar craving to be considered an honest married woman, and the husband, more often than otherwise, is alleged to be in the army, probably out of compliment to the military character of the governor and his deputy. There have been times, as I have already indirectly mentioned, when a prisoner, resisting all idea of discipline, will strongly maintain her determination not to have her hair cut. One woman, from Stafford Gaol, persisted in scoffing at all persuasive efforts of the matron, and replying thereto by a torrent of vituperation, verbal abuse. She was a tall, powerful woman with the face of a tigress and the limbs of an athlete, and one glance was sufficient to convince the matrons in attendance that it was beyond their power to master her. On such occasions, the guards on duty in the outer yards or in the men's prison were summoned to put the handcuffs on, while the necessary ceremony was gone through. In this case it required 3 men to secure her wrists, whilst her hair was cut the requisite length, she struggling and cursing and swearing long after the operation was over, even when she was in her refractory cell, while the gas was burning feebly in the wards, the matron on night duty gliding noiselessly along the passages, and the clock in the yard chiming the early hours of morning. The prison matron can remember one prisoner delirious for a day and night after the operation, the mortification of losing her hair, or the impression made upon a nature more highly sensitive than ordinary, tending to that unfrequent result. She was a young, fair Scotch girl, and her "Dinna cut my hair, oh, dinna cut my hair," rang along the deserted corridors with a plaintive earnestness. Still, in reality, it is not a barbarous ceremony. It is essentially necessary for cleanliness, and the hair is not cut to an ungraceful shortness. But the impression left upon the prisoner's mind is not a pleasant one, and I am inclined to think that there are really a few who are more sullen, more doggedly obstinate, or more ferocious, according to their respective natures, from the moment they see their locks of hair strewing the floor of the reception-room. There are many curious illustrations of prisoners' vanity under difficulties which may be readily imagined. A registry of name, a shortening of hair, a tepid bath, a change from the dress in which they are received to the brown serge, a strong cloth made from wool used to make jackets and coats, blue check apron, and muslin cap of prison uniform, the key turned upon a cell in the solitary ward, and one more unfortunate would be added to the list of millbank arrivals. A day's routine in Millbank Prison will afford a glimpse of the life that went on day after day, year after year, that everyday, toilsome, wearisome life which women by their own misdeeds had brought upon themselves. Taken as a class, female prisoners are not unhappy under the monotony of prison service. The liberty of passing to the outer world accepted, they are better off than those women consigned to the tender mercies of the poor law guardians, the workhouse authorities. They are more cared for, their health is more scrupulously regarded, their food is better, their taskmasters are, if we may believe the cruel reports which shame us as Christians and fellow men and women, more considerate and kind. Some day, when the government takes the case in hand, and workhouses as well as prisons are under its surveillance, so odious a comparison may not be drawn, but sad and certain it is that there are, in prison, advantages which are denied to the honest working classes, who have come at last to the house. There are instances of a steady, persistent course of sin in women who preferred a prison and prison treatment to the workhouse. The day at Millbank began at 6:15. The guard going off night duty in the yards rang up the prison, and by 6 o'clock every prisoner was expected to be dressed and standing in her cell, ready to show herself to the matrons on duty in the wards. At 6 o'clock the matrons and assistant matrons passed down the wards, unbolted each inner door, and flung it back to make sure the prisoner was safe and in health. The cells at Millbank Prison were furnished with 2 doors, the outer one formed of an iron grating, through which the matron passed her arm to unbolt the inner. As a rule, they were both secured at night. In exceptional cases, the inner one was left open, if the prisoner's health was delicate or the surgeon or physician doubted the ventilation of the cell. The rattle of the bolts down the ward had a peculiar effect, and was the first sign of daily life. By that time the matron who had been on night duty had reported everything quiet, or called attention to the fact that there had been a breakout in the night, a noisy woman carried to the dark by the guards brought in for that purpose, a sudden illness, or the like. Life began. A certain number of women were let out to clean the flagstones in the wards, with a matron as guard over them. A few of the best behaved dusted the matrons' rooms and made their beds. The cells by this time were all cleaned and tidied. The bed was carefully folded up, the blankets, rug shawl, and woman's bonnet placed thereon, the deal table polished, and the stones of the cell scrubbed. At 7:30 o'clock the cocoa was carried by one of the women to each cell, and a pint of that liquid meted out for the prisoner by a matron in attendance, together with a 4-ounce loaf. Their breakfast finished, and the tin pint scrubbed and polished by the prisoner, who retained it in her cell, the work of the day began. The coir picking for the newcomers, sacking and ropes made from the fibre of coconut husks and later on picked, or women who had not passed their probation stage, the bag making, the making of shirts for the male prisoners, etc. This work at Millbank was carried on by each woman in her separate cell, working silently, passively, and allowed no converse with her fellow prisoners. At Brixton, where the rule was less stringent, and where women, whose general conduct for 10 months at Millbank had been sufficiently good, were removed, the work was carried on by 2 in association in the old prison cells, and in the wing, which portion of the prison was also used as a place of exercise for the women when the wet weather prevented the airing grounds being used. At 9:15, the chapel bell at Millbank rang the prisoners to the morning service at 9:45. Each matron in charge of a ward being responsible for the number of women attending chapel and the safe return to their cells after the service was over. There was also an afternoon service at Brixton. At 12:30 o'clock water was served to the prisoners. At 1:45 o'clock the dinner bell was rung, and each prisoner provided with 4 ounces of boiled meat, half a pound of potatoes, and a 6-ounce loaf. After dinner, the cans were collected, and coir-picking, shirt-making, etc., proceeded as before, only the voices of the matrons breaking the stillness of the prison. 1 hour each day at Millbank was allowed for exercise in the airing yards, where the silent system was still enforced. A ward of women was exercised at a time, with a prison matron in attendance. The prisoners walked in Indian file, to march in single file, round and round the yard, the matron keeping a careful watch on her flock of sheep. This occupation of the prison matron was one of the most tedious and monotonous of her daily life. shivering in her bearskin cloak during the winter months and struggling against the heat in the summer. For 1 hour, these convicted women tramped unceasingly round the gravelled yard, muttering to each other when at the farthest distance from the matron in attendance, and passing her with demure looks, as though a thought of whispering in defiance of rules had never crossed their minds. Plodding on in this mill-horse round for 60 minutes, with the matron at times nodding at her post. My matron remembers once, in the days of her hard service, and that it is a very hard service, falling asleep over her charge, and going far away in her dreams to the country home she had quitted for that prison service. It was in the summer months, and there had been a restless time of it at Millbank, prisoners more obdurate, rash, and defiant, and therefore involving on prison matrons harder work and increased anxiety. Naturally, and very properly, an officer asleep at her post is always liable to suspension from duty and a summons to Parliament Street, or, at least, to the governor's quarters across the yard, and such might have been the matron's fate, had not one of the women in passing twitched her lightly by the shawl and brought her back to her consciousness, as the principal entered the airing yard. It was a thoughtful action, and demonstrates the good feeling that is often experienced by a prisoner for the matron in attendance. After the hour's airing, that is, if the airing had not been already taken in the morning, the women returned to their cells, and worked again till 5:30, when the gruel, boiled oats and water, was served into the pints of the prisoners. When the matron's tea was over in the mess room, a few prayers were read by a matron standing in the centre of each ward, so that her voice could be heard by the prisoners standing at their doors of open ironwork. After prayers, each woman answered to a name from the list called out, and then work recommenced. Coir picking, shirt, and bag making, till 7:15, when the scissors were collected. Reading, etc., was then allowed, till about 8:30, when the prisoners proceeded to make their beds. At 8:45 the gas was turned out in the cells by the matron from without, and it was supposed that the matron's duty was over for the day, and that the prisoners were in their beds. There were a few deviations from this routine in Brixton Prison, but it is scarcely worthwhile to trouble you with them, especially as the difference was not great. The hours were the same to prisoners and prison matrons at Brixton as at Millbank. At 9:00 in the evening, the matron on night duty made her appearance, and began her slow rounds of the prison, passing once an hour each cell, and ready at any instant to report sickness or breach of discipline. Slow, weary hours of prison service were these hours on night duty, pacing the dimly lighted wards, and listening for a breath or murmur that might be significant of one ill at ease within the cells, checking at times artful signals on the wall between one prisoner and another, or pausing, perhaps, for company's sake, to whisper a "good night" to someone as sleepless as herself, passing in due course to the dark cells, away from the general prison, and looking in to make sure that the woman who had been carried there for breaking her windows or tearing her blankets or assaulting her officer was quite safe, listening, perhaps, to the wild snatches of song, and might personify the screeching of some demon, vindictive and defiant, and with no claim upon humanity, striving, perhaps, to reason with her, and being sworn at for her pains. Or possibly, just possibly, if she were a favourite of the woman's, persuading her to be silent and to try to sleep. And so, from night till morning, to and fro, like a restless spirit, or a spirit rendered restless by the shadows of crime that may haunt such places at such hours, wandered the matron, till the daylight filtered through the windows and struggled with the flickering jets of gas, till the bell clanged in the outer yard, and the matrons and sub-matrons and principals woke to the business of another day.